Hello, everyone. Welcome. As you get signed in, you will see a survey on your screen. If you could take a second to fill that out, that would be great. You can also drop into the chat where you're calling in from today. As we wait, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Madison Burnett. I'm a BCBA. I lead a professional development program, and I'll be supporting throughout the webinar today. In addition to that role, I work alongside other BCBAs on a clinician-led recruitment team in an effort to support in recruiting quality professionals. If you are interested in joining us, please indicate so in the post-webinar survey at the end of this webinar, or you can email careers@manhattanpsychologygroup.com. I am going to leave that open for a little bit longer. It looks like we do have quite a few returning people and about 35% of the new attendees. So welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have everyone present today. All right. Before we begin, I would like to tell everyone a little bit about Manhattan Psychology Group. We were established in 2011, and we've continued to grow our team consisting of skilled adult and child psychologists, neuropsychologists, behavior analysts, special educators, and licensed social workers, as well as behavior interventionists. As a team, we're committed to wraparound care, which includes our wide range of services from mental health and testing to ABA and educational services. This holistic approach allows us to address various needs and challenges with compassion and care. We provide services to clients out of our Upper West Side and Long Island City offices, in home, school, and clinic-based settings, as well as through telehealth. Our team is committed to serving individuals, couples, and families of all ages in diverse settings. We're also pleased to offer these free monthly webinars for parents and professionals where we will continue to learn and foster meaningful connections. Our vision at MPG is to create a future where individuals and their families feel supported, connected, and empowered. And our mission is to provide multidisciplinary and integrated support for individuals and their families who experience mental health, behavioral, and educational challenges. Next are some housekeeping information for CEUs. For those seeking CEUs, you will need to attend this presentation in its entirety, with a minimum of 50 cumulative minutes in order to receive a link for the post-webinar survey. The survey will be sent out following the presentation after we review all of the attendance records logged via Zoom. As of January 1st, we have started charging a nominal fee for the continuing education certificate. This webinar is still free to attend, but will be $2.50 to obtain a CEU certificate. Any polls during this webinar are not required to get your CEU, but they are encouraged. We will also be leaving the chat open, but please post any questions you have in the Q&A so we can make sure that they are seen. And now I would love to introduce our presenter. Braxton is a speech-language pathologist, board-certified behavior analyst, and a coach. In addition to his credentials, he has pursued additional education in psychology, academic instruction, sensory motor integration, and effective implementation methodologies, and is currently pursuing his doctorate of business administration in industrial and organizational psychology. He has provided services from the Virgin Islands to Hawaii, New York to Mexico, and in Africa and Asia. Braxton specializes in severe and multiple disabilities and assistive technology and cognitive linguistic functioning across the lifespan. He has served as the executive director of a K-21 program of special education, adult daily living programs, and employment programs. As well, he is the CEO of an ABA company providing services to individuals with autism. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Braxton.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I will, let's see, get my slides pulled up here. All right. So, unlocking the power of radical candor, feedback that cares. So if you haven't already known, or some of you don't know, this is about the book Radical Candor. That's what we're talking about today. And just to give me kind of a level set as to where we're at, if you're someone who has read the book Radical Candor, please type the word read in the chat. If you have heard about Radical Candor and some of the ideas from it, please type heard in the chat. And if you have no idea what that book is, but this sound like a good presentation, just write newbie in the chat. Read, heard. Got a little bit of everything. A lot of people have read it. A lot of people have got a lot of newbies, people who've just heard about it. All right, so that helps. That helps me make sure that I'm providing the best information for you all, and to make sure I'm giving you exactly what you need, so we make sure that everybody gets a little bit of this. And that's what we're going to do today. So as we're getting started, I'm going to share a quote with you that there's no idea where this quote actually came from. It's been attributed to a few different people and places, but to me, it kind of encapsulates a lot of what radical candor is trying to capture. And that quote is that honesty without kindness is brutality, and kindness without honesty is manipulation. I'm going to read it again. Honesty without kindness is brutality, and kindness without honesty is manipulation. And I have to tell you that when I first read that, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But then I read a little again, I was like, oh, that it's hard, actually. I consider myself a very honest person, a very candid person. Um, and that didn't always get taken very well, but it was always that feeling of like, I'm being honest. What more do you want from me? So I'll tell you, in my relationships and even in the current one, it's definitely helped to learn about this difference. The difference of honesty without the idea of kindness isn't exactly what we're going for. And then on the flip side of that, this idea that kindness without honesty is manipulation. And I was like, well, that's just harsh. But again, the more I thought about it, the more again, in my own relationship, going, well, yeah, I did that because I was trying to be kind, I was trying to be nice, but it wasn't honest. And what happens when you have faulty data, when you have faulty information? Well, then any decision, any action that gets made based on that is inherently going to be faulty. It's almost no way that it could be accurate because it was provided with faulty data. So that was my ABA brain going through and trying to, get some analysis of it. But we're going to come back to this idea. Honesty without kindness is brutality, and kindness without honesty is manipulation, whether we intended it or not. So, as I mentioned, this is about the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott. If you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. Whether you want to be as it says, a kick-ass boss, or you just want to be a good person, you want to be a good friend, you want to be a good partner. The way it's able to piece apart some things that always kind of make sense off the cuff or in common sense, but we don't always think it right, has really been helpful. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Another really great companion book to this is the Crucial Conversations book. Typically, I see if you've read the Radical Candor book, you've probably read Crucial Conversations and vice versa. You may have heard one of my presentations on the Effective Conversations Framework, which we pull a lot from both of these books in designing that. So to start off with, we're going to talk about what is radical candor. Or more importantly, actually, when we look at that, it's radical candor is not a tool, it's a culture and a practice. So first off, let's talk about what it's not. And the reason I want to start with that is because radical candor itself, I think, gets taken out of context, or again, it's this belief that, well, as long as I'm honest, right, we're going to go through some common misbeliefs, common mistakes. And so I want to make sure we know what it's not, because what it is actually much more clean and simple. But what it's not is where people tend to overgeneralize or get that behavioral excess. So first and foremost, if you take anything from this, know that radical candor is not a tool. It's a culture and a practice. It is a way of doing things. It's a way of approaching things and a way of thinking about things. So the keys to radical candor are you have to build relationships. You have to use a universal language. You're going to be building into systems. You have to build into the systems. It can't just be, well, it's this one thing that this one person does. And we're going to talk about while one person can start it and one person can use it within a team or within a relationship, in order for it to be optimally successful, it does have to get built in as a practice. And to do that, it has to be built into systems. It is something that has to be trained through leaders at all levels. Again, it's not that you can't do it with just again, if you're working in a company with just your team, you can do it, and it can be within all levels of your team. But again, for optimal big picture, it's a cultural change. It's something that has to be role modeled. You have to role model vulnerability specifically. There has to be naming and rewarding of candor. And we're going to talk about what that looks like and what that is. But there has to be something that is rewarded and called out as a positive and something that's brought into the entire company. And the last piece is it has to ensure the quality feedback. And that is the piece that we're going to talk about today most. excuse me, excuse me. So you can see of all these different pieces, feedback is a piece of that. I think when people hear about radical candor and they think about it, especially if you haven't read the book, you just kind of heard about it, they just assume it's all about feedback. It's all about how you give feedback. As you can see from this list, that's actually a piece of it. Now, it is a critical piece. It's an important piece. It's something that you can implement today, right after this, or tomorrow. Um, so that's why we're starting with that here. So we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about what radical candor really is and what it's not. And then we're going to talk about the feedback piece to say what is that you can do moving forward as the first steps into really having radical candor as a culture and as a practice. So starting off with what radical candor is not. These are the things that I've heard or I have said myself. Oh, well, radical candor is just telling it like it is. Again, that was my first thing before when I had just heard about it but I hadn't actually read it. No, it's not telling the truth in a way that shows you care is what the real important thing is. Candor without care is just aggression with better branding. So I'm going to go through each of these. There's 10 of them in total, 10 of the most commonly heard things that I've heard over the years, 10 of the things that I said myself before I really got it. I won't read all of the corrections, but I want you to know that they're here. They're here for you to go back to and to check to get some of that clarification. If I'm being honest, that's all that matters. Again, not quite, right? How are you delivering the feedback really matters as much as what you're saying. Um, you know, radical candor is about the impact that you have. If there's a saying in the book that says, compassion or radical candor isn't measured at the point of the speaker, it's measured at the point of the listener, the receiver of that message. That's how you determine if radical candor and whether you've been operating in that way or how you've been operating. What we say here is usually that there's a difference between intent and impact. I can't tell you how often I have, whether it be here at work or at home or with family or friends, my intention of my message was drastically different than the impact of my message. And whenever we talk about what is candor and what it means to be radical is drastically different, right? And how we keep that in consideration as we're choosing what to say. Radical candor means saying hard things bluntly. Again, as we go through this, you'll see that that is not the case. If I care about them, I skip the criticism. Again, no, it's not about avoiding conversations. And that actually does the opposite, like we talked about providing faulty data and faulty information. It's a tool to manage underperformers. It's not a tool, it's a way of operating. And whether it's underperformers or high achievers, it should be the same across all. Is if this is the way in which we communicate and the way in which we operate, this honestly helps prevent there from being underachievers, helps them prevent there from being a concern or having to manage that situation in a more blunt or unpleasant situation. Because with radical candor as a practice, you've had these conversations much earlier on. I gave them radical candor once. Box checked. I've heard that so many times. Well, I was using radical candor, but it didn't work. For those of us who are BCBAs, how many times have we heard things like, well, I tried reinforcement, but it didn't work. Or I tried a token system, but it didn't work. I tried timeout, but it didn't work. It's like, well, again, it's not a tool, it's a practice, it's a way of operating. So unless you did it fully and completely, unless you made sure you did it early on and as well as through the process, then you didn't just give them, you didn't just do radical candor. If I ask for feedback, I'm doing radical candor. If I ask for feedback, I'm doing radical candor. As we get into the portion about feedback, you'll see how important feedback is. And it's not just the act of feedback, but it's the cycle of feedback. And how does that go both ways? And it's not only like what happens in the moment, like in this example of, well, I asked for feedback, but what did you do with that feedback? It is a feedback cycle. It's not just a microcycle of in the moment and what we said and what we said to each other, but what we did with that, what results came from that, and how we revisited it. I don't need radical candor with people I'm close to. again, this kind of goes back to that, well, I care about them, so I don't need to provide that, or I don't need to be as blunt and honest. It's just not the case. In fact, the people you're the closest to are the ones that you should be able to have the most radical candor with. You should be able to foster that relationship, because relationships, as you'll find here in a little bit, are what's key to being able to have radical candor. It's about establishing those relationships. So again, that's why this is part of a culture overall. Radical candor works best when I do all the talking. Again, if it's one-sided, if it's one person sharing the information, then it's not really you may be being candid with them, but that is not what radical candor is overall. Radical candor is a two-way street. It's a communication. It's a way of interacting back and forth with each other. Finally, radical candor is a leadership style. It's not a style, it's a practice. Leadership styles, all of the ones that you may think of or may be out there, can all benefit from aspects of radical candor, from implementing radical candor. It is a way of communicating within the operating system that is a leadership style. So, if nothing else, even if of all the things we're going to talk about today, if you're able to go back to these top 10 things and go, these are the things that you will hear, that you will think, that you will see. People are like, when they think they are doing radical candor, that they are implementing it and using it as a practice. This should be your quick sheet, your quick guide to being able to check yourself and or others as we are practicing, as you're coaching others potentially, and how to be communicating with peers, with staff, with each other, with you. Should give you a quick sheet guide to go, oh, if it's any of these, we think we're nailing it on the head, we're actually missing the mark. So I hope that gives you a helpful place to start from. So from what we've talked about so far, the top 10 things, are those surprising to you, right? Surprising if anything has surprised you, or common if it was common sense. Put that in the chat for me so I know where we're at. Is it common sense to you, or was it surprising? Okay, both. Should be a mix of both probably for a lot of people, right? Is you like some of it, yes. Like some of it, yeah, of course that makes sense. Or it wasn't, maybe it wasn't spelled out like that, right? Some in the middle. So like some of these, and we will talk about. So again, my goal today is I can't teach you, we can't go through the entire book that is Radical Candor, all the different aspects of it. So there's, again, like you saw from that earlier slide, there's a lot of pieces. But I want to give you the pieces to help you identify that assessment of going, where is it that we're missing? Or some detail, some refinement to go, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense now that you've said it. I just didn't think about it. I didn't see that level of analysis for it. So in a nutshell, let's talk about what radical candor is in a nutshell. Radical candor isn't radical because it's crazy. It's because it's different than the norm. So again, I think one of the common misconceptions is that when the idea of radical candor is the idea of extreme. It's extreme candor. That's what we're aiming for. That is not the case. It's radical because no one else is doing it. Like it's against the norm of what's typically operating and what's typically being done. And they talk about this in the book, especially if they have the revised version. They talk about how specifically that people thought that radical meant extreme. And that is not the case. In fact, it gets mentioned in I can't remember what the TV show was, Suits, I think. They poke fun at it. I mean, like, oh, I've been using this new thing, radical candor, and I've been able to say exactly what I want, and HR can't get mad at me. Things like that. So, that is not what it is. In radical candor, leadership is not about authority. It's about relationships and trust. So again, one of the big pieces that gets missed in radical candor and in longer trainings on it is around the fact that in order to quote unquote do radical candor, to be using that as a culture and a practice, building relationships is at the heart of it. It is about being conscientious, being engaged, being a part of the group and the whole, and caring about the individual while also being clear. They say clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So how are you able to do both? Especially when you look at a professional setting, it's a professional situation. I think there becomes such a fear of crossing the boundary or you know being too close to someone or asking something that's inappropriate, a fear of HR, basically, that we have overcorrected and gotten to a place of a lack of caring, a lack of engagement. That's not because we don't care, but because again, we are afraid. We don't know where that line really is. We don't know how to navigate the fact that the line is not a fine black line, a very clear cut line. It's actually pretty wide. It's actually pretty gray. And it is the relationships that we could create with people that we're interacting with consistently, whether that be our direct reports or our supervisors, or whether it's the team, a parent working with their team of BCBAs and therapists at their clinic or at the school, or working across teams from a clinic to a school. It is those relationships that allows us to be more candid and then is able to be more honest and be able to make the best progress along the way. So when we're looking at what is radical candor, it falls across two dimensions. There is one that is care personally, and that is emotional intelligence and authenticity and empathy, as well as challenge directly, which is what people mostly think about around radical candor is that challenging, honesty, accountability, and a feedback culture. But you have to have both of these. And that's where the title feedback that cares is that feedback that's honest, it's accountable, it's consistent, is only as good as the ability to care personally, which develops those relationships, which involves emotional intelligence. It requires that. It requires authenticity and empathy. In order to have the authenticity and empathy and intelligence, you're going to have vulnerability. You're going to have to be listening, and you have to have a willingness to be wrong. So whenever we're talking about our feedback and our feedback loops, there's an assessment that I have you fill out. And so as we're looking through that, one of the things we talk about is, did you admit to being wrong? Did you admit to being that you didn't know something? Are you asking for feedback? When you ask for feedback, are you asking for advice? They're asking for other people's opinions. Again, whether that be a supervisor to someone that they are supervising, or vice versa, or across laterally, across two colleagues. So making sure that we are looking at the complete piece of this. In order to care personally, you're going to have to be vulnerable at times. You have to be listening at times, and you have to be willing to be wrong, and even put it out there when that happens to set that tone, to set that culture. Because again, this is a culture, this is a practice, and you have to set that tone. And then another piece of this, it's important for me to highlight is the difference between empathy and compassion. So you'll see in a minute, we'll talk about, instead of radical candor, I'm going to refer it to compassionate candor. And I want to make sure that people highlight the difference between being empathetic and being compassionate. Empathetic is the ability to understand someone's emotion, to be able to connect with that, to see where they're feeling and how they're reacting. And mind you, being empathetic doesn't mean you agree. I can understand why the child that I'm working with is frustrated and upset. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't be expected to do what they're expected to do. Same thing with a staff or a coworker or my spouse and significant other. I can understand why this is frustrating. It doesn't change necessarily what I think or what I believe, even if it's a personal or professional opinion. I can understand why somebody else would disagree or be frustrated with the fact that I disagree with them, but that doesn't change the fact that I do disagree with them. So you can have empathy without being in agreement. Now, compassion, on the other hand, compassion is the actions that you take, being moved to action. I could see someone who is hurt and injured, and I can have empathy for the fact that they're hurt and injured. But if it doesn't move me to take action and to do something different in order to help them, to prevent that from happening again in the future, that's compassion. I have compassion for a group of people or for a situation. And because of that, I will act differently and perform differently. That's drastically different than having empathy, which is understanding and feeling the feelings. And I will say, I think a lot of times in our daily lives or in our society, we get those confused. Um, there's a lot of people who have empathy for people, but it doesn't stir them to action. It doesn't stir them to act differently. And that's different. That would be compassion. So we need to make sure that we are aware of the difference. I see a lot of leaders or a lot of people who can empathize with someone, but it doesn't change the way they act or how they operate. So it doesn't necessarily have compassion. Now, that being said, sometimes the compassionate thing to do is to continue to challenge directly, right? So the the look of radical candor overall, like I said, has these two dimensions, and that looks like this. You can care personally, or you can, challenge directly. If you are high levels of challenging directly, but you've got low levels of caring personally, they call that obnoxious aggression. I think that's what you probably think of when people do it wrong, quote unquote, is this obnoxious aggression. That leads to defensiveness, and there's little change. Now, on the flip side of this, if you have high levels of caring personally and low levels of challenging directly, you have what they call ruinous empathy, which that leads to ignorance and no change because you're not actually giving people the information they need to make the right decisions. I've seen this a lot of times. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten to a, a annual review, and the person that one of my supervisors is providing this annual review, and I'm sitting in on it, etc. And the staff is just shocked. They've never heard this information before. And when I go back and check, I see no evidence that these things were actually discussed. Well, I didn't want to, I felt bad for them. They were going through this or doing this, etc. I go, in that case, you have created ruinous empathy and has been extremely unfair. They didn't actually have the chance to make the changes that we would like to have seen from them. Um, on the flip side, when you have minimal challenging directly and you have minimal caring personally, then you get mistrust. This is just manipulative. This is just saying one thing and doing another, etc. But ideally, with the greater amount of caring personally, as well as the greater amount of challenging directly, then you are able to get that what we call radical candor. And that's where you get growth and profound change. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about what that looks like. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. But I do want you to have some examples. Talk about obnoxious aggression. I think that's, again, the most common one when you think about, oh, well, how could this be used inappropriately or incorrectly? This is it, obnoxious aggression. Each one of these, you get 3 examples. I want to just to give you kind of different levels of what that might look like if you're kind of missing the mark. And this is a way of kind of self-identifying and being able to see, well, where am I falling in these areas? The idea of something like a senior executive give feedback that's technically correct, but laced with condescension. This isn't at all the level I expect from someone at your grade. Like, oh, well, some of these times when I think about some of these examples, I'm like, well, I've heard that. I mean, how is that bad? Well, it's because it's not intended to actually support. You can say that we're not meeting the expectations, absolutely. But if the intention is to kind of tear down or to be uh, uh, demeaning versus saying the pieces of clearly of what it is and what it's not and why it hurts that meeting, especially if this is the first time they're hearing it, you aren't having a whole lot of caring, right? You're not caring directly about the person. So what does this look like in manipulative insincerity? Asking for feedback and then ignoring it. Again, you'll notice the last example is I try to find ones or come up with ones that I've seen that are the kind of the minutia, the ones that seem so common that you wouldn't have thought. But a senior leader asks their team, how can I improve? But shows no reaction, takes no notes, and makes no change. There was no point. Again, I'm asking for feedback. But if I don't look like I actually care about the feedback, I'm not involving it, I'm not actually following up with it, I'm not coming back to you later on, or I'm not showing any change and talking about it, then that was just manipulative insincerity. You weren't actually caring about the people. You may have had empathy for them, but you clearly didn't have compassion. and you definitely weren't being challenging directly for yourself. Because if you were, you would have actually taken those on and actually followed through with those. So it just becomes manipulation. Try to talk the talk, but definitely not walking the walk. Um, when we talk about ruinous empathy, this is one that I think does get tricky. It's one that I see a lot, especially within our field, is we care. We are inherently a caring field. And if anything, when I see people flip over to obnoxious, what comes across and would be classified as obnoxious aggression, I think it's typically because they care too much. You've talked about people having such a soft center, a soft heart, and so they have to put on a hard shell. I do feel like this is frequently what I see is that because they tend to maybe could be into ruinous empathy is the side they would err on. So instead they've erred on the side of almost obnoxious aggression. They're being too blunt, too clear, because it's hard to navigate those spaces, not only just interpersonally, but also internally. Being able to have empathy for someone, but still being able to challenge directly, being able to feel those feelings and connect with what they're going through, even if you completely disagree with it, um, it's hard to navigate. So instead, they kind of tend to drop down on this axis. Like I can't handle these feelings. I can't handle navigating this amount of caring personally. So I'd rather drop down a little bit. So even if you were doing a great job of challenging directly and you were trying to care personally, but it's just too much. Maybe it hits too close to home. Maybe it's something that you're insecure about yourself. Um, we tend to then drop down on the caring personally axis, but that ends up taking us into from radical candor into this obnoxious aggression. So finally, we're going to talk about compassionate candor. So again, radical candor, and they even say again in the revised book, they talk about, well, radical candor, it's catchy. It gets people's attention. It's gonna sell books, essentially. It's gonna make people want to open the title and read it. But really what they're aiming for is compassionate candor. It's that they don't want it to be radical, honestly, by the definition of unusual and different. They want it to be compassionate. They want it to be that we are able to care personally about someone while also challenging them directly. And that is caring, challenging someone to be the best version of themselves. And you'll see in some of these examples, challenging them to be that best version is caring for them because you believe that this is what they would want. This is what they are looking for. Now, if someone isn't in alignment with that, if someone doesn't have that same value, doesn't want to be challenged, doesn't have a desire to perform that, it becomes a question of whether or not they're a right fit. Right? Are they a good culture fit? And I'll say that gets thrown around a lot and used as a weapon. Oh, they're not a good culture fit. Well, that they're not a good culture fit, or is it that they weren't actually challenged in a respectful way? They weren't given radical candor, compassionate candor as a culture and a practice overall. It was just done as a way of using at the end, right? So some of the examples, right? Executive confronting toxic behavior. So CEO pulls a senior VP aside and says, your sarcasm in meetings shuts people down. And I know you don't want that. I care about your brilliance and how you impact others. Let's work on this together. So you see in this that we're saying, I'm being honest. This is the effect that your sarcasm's having. If you were in my effective conversations framework, one of the things we talk about is, be clear about what your expectation is, be clear about what the experience was, the behavior that what occurred, talk about the impact that that had on people, on you, on the team, on the others, and then checking to see if that was the intention. Was that your intent? And conversations like this are the perfect example for using that effective conversations framework of saying, this is what's happening, what I'm seeing. I don't believe that's what you want. I know you don't want that. And hopefully you'd have that relationship and to know that about them. I care about your brilliance and how you impact others. So I do care about that. I want that for you. I don't want people to see you as this thing that I don't think you are, or that the impact that you're having isn't the intent that I think is behind that. So because of that, let's work on this together. How can we solve this problem? How can we be different and operate differently? What can I do to support you, to coach you, to help you identify those things when they come up? So a teammate redirecting communication style. Team member privately tells a peer, "You've got great ideas, but they sometimes get lost because you talk over others. I want to help you be heard." Want some tips I've learned? So asking, right? Asking permission to share these pieces. But again, focusing on the intent that you have versus the impact that you're having and wanting to help them. A junior staff member speaking up to a supervisor. A direct report says to the manager, "I appreciate your feedback, but the way it was delivered last time felt rushed and a little sharp. I want to keep learning. Can we revisit this?" So I want to make sure that we highlight that this, again, goes both ways. A culture of radical candor means that not only can I, as a supervisor, be sharing that with someone that I'm trying to give feedback to, but if I've truly established a culture of radical candor, I've got that expectation, I've made it welcoming for us BCBAs, as it gets reinforced, it should also flow upwards as well as horizontally and diagonal in every direction. Is that they should also be able to use this radical candor structure and ideas, be able to give feedback to me about what is it that I'm doing, how am I doing this? I should be asking for that, and so they're able to provide that to me. So if we've looked at these different dimensions of radical candor, and we've talked about, like as long as we're what it looks like when we go up or down in either one of them. And to be clear, you're going to. It's going to happen. And it's even okay, right, that it happens because a variety of things are going to impact you. A variety of things can can trigger you, can trigger the other person. Sometimes we do have to err on the side of caution of one way or the other, but we need to make sure that we're doing it intentionally and strategically, that we are aware that this particular thing that I feel really self-conscious of, or that I've had bad history with in the past, well, maybe I'm not so good at caring personally about that because of my own history, my own experiences. And so being able to recognize that when that happens, I'm probably not going to be the best at radical candor. I will say one of the things that happens is for me, right, is around, like we're talking about amount of work. I am a workaholic. I know that I am. All my friends know that I am. I think most of the people that work with me know that I am. So I had to learn and be very careful when people talk about capacity and workload. That was something that I was not good about caring personally about and being clear about that because I had an innate bias because of, I grew up on a farm. There are 7 days a week work, even on Sunday when the Sabbath, we're told not to work on it, but we still do because the animals still got to get fed. We still got things to do. And so I have worked really hard and I continue to be mindful. Anytime that's the topic that comes up, I make sure that I'm evaluating myself and how I'm reacting and how I'm thinking about this in regards to the person. Now, do I still have to challenge directly? Because I'm like, well, this is still the expectation that has been set for all of us. Yes, but I do have to check my own bias. I'm constantly revising to make sure that I am still caring personally in that process. So, how is this given some context for even those of you, especially those of you who haven't read the book? Do you feel like you have a good picture between what radical candor isn't and what it is of what radical candor is meant to be, what we're aiming for, some pieces that'll allow you to kind of sort that out? I guess like looking at this slide, compassionate candor is asking for criticism, offering specific, sincere praise and kind, clear criticism, gauging how that's affecting others. Yes, yes, yes. Makes sense. Great. So this is your intensive uh, uh, review of what radical candor is meant to be. Again, how to implement that is far more than we're going to be able to get to in today. That is a lot of different pieces. You can look at that slide above of going, there's a lot to doing this. There's a lot more nuance to it, a lot of more specifics. The most important thing that I have to emphasize is being able to care personally and challenge directly and be able to balance that out is meant to build relationships. The stronger the relationship, the more you are able to be more direct, to be have more challenge, and to be able to be higher up on this, compassionate candor uh, quadrant over here. You'll hear people talk about, some of the greatest, quote unquote, greatest CEOs, again, depending on your metrics, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. They were intense, right? There were fights, there were disagreements, there were arguments, and depending on how you view it, and depending on who you've talked to in those situations, you would assume, I think, that this person was being obnoxious aggression, right? They don't care. They're doing these pieces. However, when you've heard the interviews and talked to some of the people, if you've cared personally, you've built strong relationships, and this goes again for your friends and for your loved ones, your partners. Um, if you have a strong relationship because the person has cared personally, there is a durability. It can withstand challenging directly more. That is when you can be more compassionately candid, because there is that relationship. And that's why that is so important to be building. And it is this cycle of compassionate candor at the right amount and the right level, right? Builds relationships. Building relationships allows, compassionate candor, radical candor. So they are a symbiotic relationship, and you have to keep that in mind as you're doing this. If you do one without the other, it will fail, because without building relationships, without caring personally, it's the radical candor is always going to feel like obnoxious aggression, because there isn't the relationship. While you may have empathy, you may care personally. If that doesn't come with compassion, which causes the actions that go with it, the asking questions, asking for feedback, etc., you're not going to be high enough on that balance. Now, I want to tell you before we get into this feedback section, one of the biggest, most common mistakes that I have made over the years is coming in with my radical candor, like right off the bat, hitting the ground running. Um, In fact, just this most recent situation, my most recent employment, I came in having been with a company that I've been with for years, and we've gone through this and we've talked about all these things, and we are all pretty radical. We have these disagreements. We have this conversation because we can both be radically candid back and forth to each other. And it may look like a fight to those who are unaccustomed to it, but it is not. It may be heightened, but it is with caring, and we do it with caring. And if we don't, if at some point we miss that, we apologize for it and we correct for it. We ask for feedback afterwards. How do you feel about this? Are we good? Did I overstep? Etc. So coming into an organization or to a situation that is not accustomed to that, or an individual relationship that's not accustomed to that, and I'm caring personally, and I'm challenging directly, I'm really high up in that quadrant. They're not accustomed to that. Again, let me go back. I believe I'm caring personally. Let me say that. I thought I was, but what I realized is that if I was actually caring personally, truly, I would have been better about identifying where they are in that process, what they can withstand, what they can handle, without slipping over into ruinous empathy. And again, other conversations we can talk about and other presentations around how do you do that? How do you navigate that? How do you label it? How do you tact it? Saying this is what I'm doing in the bit, making sure you have that feedback loop and asking for that, sharing that in advance. This is what I'm expecting, and this is how this kind of will operate, and I'm going to get that information back from you. Helps work on that. So quality feedback. What is quality feedback? In our last 15 minutes, what is quality feedback? It's choosing the right time to address issue. That is caring personally, like I was just mentioning. Yeah, so I see this thing. Being direct and being straightforward about it, being challenging directly, is definitely a part of radical candor. However, I've got a staff or a coworker or my spouse who's in the middle of doing a thing, and I try to give them this feedback about the thing that they're doing that's not really going to change what's going on, or it's going to be the effect that I'm going to have, the impact is going to be just to make them more irritated and frustrated than it is actually going to help them do it better, even if it would make it better. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. Now's not the time. I fight with, again, one of the things I work on is I saw something come through. Do I need to send them a chat or a Slack message? Do I need to email them right now? Or can this wait for our regularly scheduled meeting? More often than not, it can wait for our regularly scheduled meeting. And that makes whatever we talk about feel way less challenging, way less like a fire, way less like a attack, because the urgency with which I respond to a situation dictates the urgency in which it comes across, right? So one of the things that Radical Candor talks about is your meeting cadence. And we can do a whole presentation itself on one-on-ones and how to have an effective one-on-one. Feedback is a piece of one-on-ones, but over one-on-ones as a whole is a whole piece you need to make sure that we're doing effectively. Having regular scheduled time with people, making sure that it doesn't get bumped, because every time we bump a meeting, how many, if you've had your own supervisor or you as yourself, or if it's a parent or a coworker with somebody else, that they cancel the meeting, that they're like, oh, something else came up and I can't do it, which intentionally or unintentionally, that you're not important. What we have to talk about isn't important. We have a very strict rule that for the one-on-ones that we do have, we have a frequency that's appropriate, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on situation. It does not get canceled. It can be moved, it can be rescheduled if something comes up, but it does not get canceled because what we have to talk about is important. Even if there's all these other fires, even if everything else is going on, um, you are important. The situation is important. What we're talking about, what we have to work through, what I'm doing for you, what you're working on with the company, your role, our relationship is important. So I will not cancel that unless you tell me you don't need it. We both agree we don't need it. That's different. But if that's the case, we'll change the frequency. So that's one example of how do we make sure that our one-on-ones are quality and make a difference. So the three main forms of feedback is guidance, which are there to develop, praise, which is to reinforce, and criticism, which is to correct. So pretty much anything you say when you're giving feedback, it's going to fall into one of those three things. The question is, are you giving all three? Are you making sure that whenever we're having a conversation and whenever you're interacting, whether it be your one-on-one or something else, what's the purpose? What's your intent? What's the function of the information that you're providing? Are you trying to develop them? Are you trying to praise them to reinforce the thing? Or are you trying to criticize them to correct them? And I will say, at least in my experience over the years, most of the time, whenever it's criticized to correct, the same thing could have been achieved with guidance to develop. And so I would encourage you to really examine if you're like, okay, I had to criticize to correct. Why couldn't I have guided to develop instead? And it's again, it's a habit, it's a practice, it's a culture, and being able to do that. So in criticism to correct, we would be looking at, you know, basically saying you did it wrong. That's the goal is just to know that you did this thing wrong. It's incorrect. Whereas with guidance to develop is going, what could have been done differently here? Or what do you think the impact is of this thing? This is what you did. What do you think the impact was on the people around you? So in guidance, I'm asking them to problem solve themselves. I'm asking them to self-identify where a problem may have occurred. Now, if they can't, if they get through this and they can't, we may have to give criticism. We may have to actually say, I'm correcting you on this. But if I haven't at least tried to guide first to develop, because criticism, don't be wrong, a corrective statement can correct, but it's not going to be nearly as impactful as someone coming to that conclusion on their own or understanding the analysis behind it, the process of thinking. And I'll tell you, I talk about these same things when I do my parent coaching with how parents are talking with their kids, how spouses are talking to each other or friends talking. So looking at how can we guide and how can we develop. So I'll tell you if the people I see who use a lot of criticism or correction, they use a lot of correction, they tell them what it should be done differently, um, is frequently the ones who I end up falling into a micromanagement trap. Even if they don't want to be micromanagers, and I have a whole have a whole assessment and presentation on why good managers micromanage and not basically because even though they don't want to. Um, it's because then people expect to get the answer. They expect to be told versus how to think about it. So these are your main pieces of what quality feedback looks like. The last biggest piece of it, I would say, is multi-directional feedback loops and making sure that you have built that in. Leaders should actively solicit and deliver and normalize feedback. So it's not only giving it, it's also asking for it. Normalize that it's occurring, normalize that you're asking for it and then you're giving it. Because again, the goal is not perfection, but continuous learning, making sure that we are constantly learning and doing better. If I, especially after I feel like I've had to give some very direct feedback that I've had to really make sure that I am challenging directly, I always ask for that feedback back of going, how is that landing for you? How is it that, how does that feel? Is there, obviously, what are your questions about it for clarifications? And then also the next time I meet with them, it's going, hey, last time felt really heavy for me. I'm not putting it on you. I'm not saying last time was really heavy, or I'm sure that was really heavy for you. I don't know. I don't know your feelings. I'm not gonna put that in your mouth. I'm not gonna make those decisions for you about your feelings. I'm gonna say, I thought it felt heavy, or I could see why it would be heavy. I want to check on how I delivered it. How did that come across? Could I have phrased it differently? Is there other information that we didn't cover that would help now that you've had time to think about it? So again, asking for that feedback consistently and then doing something with it. Feedback must happen in real time. Performance reviews are to review what's already been discussed and write out what's planned for the future. Again, a huge big one of if I ever see that a annual review has information in it that has not been shared previously, I will challenge that, and I will probably tell the person who's writing it, again, when I'm checking these and reviewing these, that that can't be in there. I'm not going to allow it. It's an annual review of what we have done over the year. It is not your regular scheduled feedback. If nothing else, because the annual review is heavy. It is a big piece of it. And this is not the time to have been surprised. So if anybody comes and is surprised by that, then that's to me typically an indicator of we need to be changing our feedback systems. So again, why this is so important that there is a system in place. How are we making sure that the feedback is happening? Because even the best of us, I know myself, while I teach about giving feedback and having it reoccurring and consistent, it falls off. Things happen, bigger priorities come up. How are we building it into our day, our week, our month, our year to make sure that it's happening and that we're checking it? Tone, context, and timing matter. Radical candor is about delivery, not just content. Like I mentioned before, impact is measured at the point of the receiver. So the goal of radical candor, compassionate candor, is to care individually as well as challenge directly. In order to do that, we have to be measuring it at the point of the impact, right? The point of the receiver. And that's why the feedback loop is so important. Good leaders ask for advice, not just give it. There's a difference between asking for feedback and asking for advice. It can be subtle sometimes, but feedback is just asking for information. Advice is assuming and believing that somebody else has information that you don't, has knowledge that you don't, and that you are valuing them and what they have to offer and contribute. This can be done in your one-on-ones, right? And of saying, I believe that you are better at this than me, or that you have more information, more insights as to how these people are thinking or how this operates. Give me some advice on this piece, etc. Same sort of thing in group meetings or as you are planning something, or if your team is in charge of a thing, reaching out to someone else again, whether it be laterally or above or below, that is going to be able to have that information or that might have some expertise that someone else doesn't, or maybe just has it differently. And creating that space and creating that respect and appreciation builds that confidence, builds that connection and relationship so that whenever they need to engage in compassionate candor and to challenge directly, they feel like they can and like they're able to because you've shown that mutual respect. So when giving feedback specifically, again, that's what we're working on today is that specific piece of sharing that information and giving the feedback. Here's some pieces that will help in some of that phrasing. Because I care about your success. I noticed something that I think could help you grow. Here's what you're doing really well. Here's something that I challenge you on. The goal and the purpose is to grow, to help, to make everyone the best version of themselves. I regularly say, I don't call people out, I call them up. That is the intention of the work that I do. And whenever when I'm trying to establish that culture, I said, my intention is not to call you out, it's to call you up to the person that you tell me that you are, that I believe that you are in order to be here with us, whether that be working with us and with my partner or in a volunteer groups that I'm in. This is what we're here for, why we're here for. We've all agreed on this. So I would be calling you up to that belief or who you've told me you want to be. Similarly, for asking for feedback, what's one thing I could do better as your leader? Have I ever said something that made it hard for you to be honest with me? So this isn't just asking about this individual situation, but overall, asking for that feedback on what have I done, what's going on, or again, whether I intended to or not, because my intentions are irrelevant compared to my impact. What have I done that has created that atmosphere and that feeling among us? So that way I can correct that and move forward. I want to get better at blank. What's something you've noticed? So there's some starter phrases, ways to make sure you're already framing it in a way that should be within the realm, right? Heading the direction of radical candor. This is an individual interaction assessment for you to kind of reflect back on an interaction that you've had. Again, whether it be with a significant other, a coworker, a direct report, etc. I've got so many of these assessments that I've made from the book, how to evaluate the culture at your company or within your team, etc. So it's hard for me to pick what to put in here to get it all fit in. But for you to be able to look at and rate yourself 1 through 5 when you look back on the interaction you just had with somebody and where did you fall? Honestly, now that you have an idea of the quadrants and there's 2 dimensions and the 4 quadrants, where would that really be? I want to highlight something that the book says. I don't know if I disagree with it or not, but it's one thing it's very clear about is that you use the quadrants, as a way of assessing yourself, not others. It is for self-assessment. It is not for analyzing others. Now, do we as humans naturally still tend to do it? I think yes. But I do want to highlight that the book is very clear about that. This is for self-assessment. It's for you to know about you and how you can be better, and each person taking their own responsibility for it, which is again why this is a culture, not just a tool. So I hope that as we've talked about this, you really see how radical candor is not a tool, it's a culture and a practice. And I hope that you also see that, honesty without kindness is brutality, and kindness without honesty is manipulation. Thank you all.
Braxton. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We do have some questions in the Q&A that I will be sending over to Braxton for some responses. If you do think of anything after we do end the webinar today, just feel free to shoot an email to me. I will drop our email in the chat for Braxton. Again, thank you so much, Braxton. It was as always, very enlightening and informative. So definitely appreciate that. If anybody has any questions, I will stay on for a few extra minutes. Braxton, you don't have to, but thank you again.
I have 5 minutes. I can do 5 minutes.